Hey YouTube, what's up? Welcome to today's video where we'll be building Coursetro's fundamentals of UI design into HTML and CSS and a little bit of JavaScript. The website looks like this, pretty much exactly like the Adobe XD design that Gary did on his video, except for a few differences. Um, just a little caveat is that this video is not sponsored by or has not been asked by Coursetro or anybody to do. I'm doing this out of my own will, and I definitely want everybody to watch the front end fundamentals that Gary will bring out as well, because he will probably give way more experience and detail into his video. But without further ado, let's get started. So to get started, I'm just going to create a directory in my code directory that I'll call UI example. I'll cd into the UI example and open my code editor. So to get started, I actually have already created some assets in Adobe XD that I'll just import into the project. The assets I've created is the server image, the area on the, okay, let me just show you on the website itself. I've created this little logo in SVG. I created this server thing from scratch. It's not as pretty as the original one, but I tried my best. I also created this little scroll thing that's animated. This blue area is a SVG. I downloaded these icons from iconfinder.com. I got this lady from Google Images, and this is the same logo as up top here. So I will put this code into a repository with all the assets, so you can just clone the repo. I'll put the link in the description. So to get started, I'm just going to create the index.html so that we can start skeletoning creating the skeleton of the project. I'm going to use the image shortcut to create a quick little starting point. I'm going to call this UI design, and I'll leave those the same. And just to make sure that I don't forget, I'm going to create the JavaScript file, and I'm going to create the CSS file. These are the only three code files that I'll be using in this project because it's quite a simple project to do. There's not a lot of complicated code, etc. So we can just do it all in vanilla. So I'm going to get started by creating the HTML flow of the document. And the way I kind of did this is I imagined from the Adobe design where these elements will kind of reside and what their tag names will be, and I kept in mind that how the CSS will interact with these elements. So you will see that I use display flex quite a lot in this example because I like it, and this example is basically only for desktop. It's not that responsive because I didn't do any media queries or different screen sizes, etc. If you want to, you can clone the repository or submit a pull request with your responsive code added if you want to. So first of all, I'm going to create that white space that Gary was talking about, where everything is kind of pushed a little bit more to the middle with a wrapper or something, because we don't want everything to be spaced out and it doesn't look attractive or aesthetic when everything is just has all the space in between it. So we're gonna wrap everything into a wrapper. Then the first element on the page will be the navbar, which I'll just give a class of navbar as well. And in there we have the logo, which will just take us to the home. And the logo is actually an image, so I'll create the image, and it's in my assets folder /logo, and let's just call this 26 and 4. that'll be the alt text for all my images because I'm quite lazy. But for now, I'll just add in some of the widths and stuff that I've played around with while coding this, because I don't want the images to be huge on the whole screen where you can't see any of the content. So I'll just make random widths on them for now. So in the navbar we also have the nav items, and I'll give this this UL a class of nav links, because it kind of contains all the links that we want to use, and those links are home, services, about, and contact. So there's 4 of them. So we'll do services, about, and contact. And ideally what you maybe would want to do is create an A tag inside of the li so that they can actually link to pages. But because this is just a mock-up or an example, I'm not going to do that. I'll maybe just add some cursor CSS to make sure it looks like a link when we hover on it or something like that. Now that we're done with the nav, we can move on to the next section, which I'll call the landing section, because that's what we see as soon as we get onto the page. And this landing section has 3 elements. It has it has 4 elements actually. It has the image, the large server image, and it also has the text, the leading text, which is which I'll give a class of Euro title, and I'll put the text in there, which was something like web hosting for the modern era, eras. And there's a subtitle in there, which I'll just call subtitle, which is a little bit, remember where he spoke about the hierarchy, so it's going to be smaller and maybe a little bit more faint, I mean transparent or less opaque. But this one said go serverless and pay only for what you use. And then finally, the last element on this part of the page is going to be that scrolling thing, that little scroll indicator, so that the user knows that this page should be scrolled. And I'll add these alt text just to make sure that we take care of our completeness. For the scroller, I just want to make it a little bit smaller for now, because it's probably going to be the whole page before we add CSS. And that is it for our landing section. So now we can start with the offering section, which I just called it that. I didn't really know what to call it. So these offerings have 3 little boxes. So this whole section will be the offering section, and then these boxes need their own class so that we can play with the padding and alignment and stuff. So I'm gonna actually just create a div. I think you can just do this, offer boxes, and in there I'll do an image with the source of assets. So these icon finder things I found on iconfinder.com in case you want that information. And after the image, I'll create a p tag with the class of offer text, if I can type. And Emmet or VS Code has this nice little shortcut where you can do lorem and a number, and it gives you a nice little short text. I think that's a little bit too much. I'm gonna maybe actually just redo that as maybe 30 words. It looks a little bit better. So now that we have that, I'm just gonna be quite lazy and copy and paste this 2 more times and change up the icons that we show, and that's the cart and that's also the SEO thing. It's not the exact same icons as the UI design fundamental course used, because I couldn't find the free version of that, so I just used something else. But it doesn't matter, you can use whatever you like. And then the next section, we will call this testimonial. So as you can see, I'm kind of breaking down the page into understandable sections that kind of make sense. Everything that's grouped together in a specific section gets its own tag, and it's easier to maintain and read your code and actually style it later on with the CSS. So the next section is the testimonials. I'm going to create a div inside of the testimonials div. That's the testimonial container. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want to flex this item as well and do some different things to it than the actual section itself. That'll make sense in a minute when we get to the HTML, CSS. So the testimonials, I got this this image of a random lady, and after I'm gonna give that, yeah, I'll just keep that the image, and then I'll add a p tag with lorem maybe 20, and we'll just add the quotation marks so that it looks like a quote. And right below that, I'm gonna add another p tag that is gonna be the name of the person. So I'll just call it dot name, just so I can target it when we actually use it, and that's going to be Jane Doe. I'll just copy and paste that as well for the sake of time and retention, because the HTML usually is a little bit boring, but it is important to know how to structure your HTML before you start actually coding the CSS and JavaScript, because the HTML provides the basis of your classes and structure of the page so that you can use specific CSS properties. So next up, we're going to finish off with the call to action and the footer. Alright, so for the call to action section, we'll just create another section like always, and the class name will be CTA. In this section, I want to make the text and the button that sort of calls on the user to click and follow this action that we set up for them. So I'm going to get started with an h1 that has a class of CTA text, and in there we're going to say start your free trial now, and below that I'm going to add a button, and the button's text will be get started. Let's save that. And then for the final section of the page, I'm going to make it a little bit more semantic and actually call it the footer. And in the footer, we're going to have two divs. And the reason I put two divs in there is so that I can use display flex, and then these two divs will act as a container for the items that we flex. So we'll see that in the CSS. So the first one's going to be the left side of the footer. I'll just call it left footer, and in there we're going to have the logo, and we'll put the image, the same image that we had as the logo on top, we'll put in there, assets, logo, SVG, and for now I'll just make the width 200 pixel, and the alt, as always and as inconsistent as always, I'll just call it 26 and 4. So along with the the logo we had this little, you know, a little bit more information about the company's address or whatever. I'm just gonna make up a fictitious place, sunny place. It's probably actually is a place like that, but whatever. So right footer is the section that will be on the right of the page, and in there we just have two of the same types of things, which I'll just call link for now. I guess you could make this A tags, but I'm not making real links, so I'm just gonna make it P tags and change the cursor because I am weird like that. So let's do link, and then we do privacy policy and save that. Also, what I want to do before we get to the CSS and JavaScript is I just actually want to move the script into the bottom of the HTML so that we don't have to wait for the document to load in the JavaScript before we can start picking out elements on the page, etc. So at the moment this is going to look pretty horrendous, so let's stop this live server and open the one that we are busy with right now, and that's what it currently looks like. Just a lot of, wow, that is huge. So this is the HTML structure, the skeleton of our page. It is now our job to sort of turn it into the design that we saw Gary make in his UI fundamentals video. So let's jump into the CSS. So the way I like to start off most of my CSS files is just by doing some resetting on the body. I'm gonna set the margin and padding to 0 so that we don't get that space that's naturally added to it. And another thing that we forgot to do in the beginning of the video is to add the link to the Montserrat font that Gary uses in the video. So I'm just going to copy that from Google Fonts. You can find it there as well. The link will look like this, and I'm taking both the 400 and the 600 font weight, which is not too much and won't affect your loading speed a lot. But if you take the more font weight you take, the slower your document will load. So for this one, I'm just going to take the regular and the semi-bold. So that allows us to go in the CSS and just set the font family right off the bat, Montserrat, I think that's how you spell it. And for the backup font, I'm going to use just the regular sans serif. Save that, and if we go back to the site, you can now see that the fonts have all changed to Montserrat. Nice looking font. I'm going to close down the example page here. And another thing is the assets that I created. I didn't export this SVG with white color for the footer. That's probably very important because if you think about the fundamentals that Gary spoke about, the contrast of this black on this dark navy blue or whatever color this isn't very it doesn't contrast a lot. So this might be a bad design decision that I made here, and I 100% attribute that to the laziness of not wanting to change the color and export it from Adobe XD. But you're welcome to go into find the assets and open them with your Adobe XD and just change the color to white. I'm not going to do that, and I'm sorry in a way, but actually not very, because laziness is real. Another thing that I noticed on this page is that the spacing on, the consistency of this space compared to this space might not be it might not be accurate. So I might have a look at that as we build the page. Gary also mentioned that he would like to see a little animation on the scroll so that it indicates uh, some visual importance that this page should be scrolled. And if you load this page the first time, but I closed down the server now, let me just run that server one more time. I have to stop this one. So if you load this page for the first time, I added a feature where if you scroll 2 clicks, 1, 2, it will automatically snap down. So if we just start scrolling, it snaps down to this section of the page. Because I feel like once you start scrolling off of this page, it's kind of clear that you don't want to see any of this anymore. There's no reason for anyone to want to scroll quite slow on this page because they've already seen what they need to see, and scrolling slower. So after the first scroll, this resets. So if you scroll up, it won't do it again. But I feel like it's a waste of time for the user and just a better experience if we snap the scroll down instead of having the user scroll to the specific point, and we get to control what they see on the next scroll. So if it snaps to here, all of this is sort of aligned in a way that looks aesthetic. Whereas if the user scrolls by him or herself, they can stop here or stop here, which kind of breaks the design a little bit. So that's just a personal preference that I had, and I don't know if that's a good design structure for user experience. As you know, as Gary said, user experience and user interface is two different things. So in my opinion, I would like that experience a bit more than having to control my own scroll. So let's just get back into the code. So after resetting my document, I like structuring my CSS the same way as my HTML. So I'll start from the elements that the hierarchy that they follow in the document itself. I'll target them in the CSS in the same order just to make it consistent and readable. So we'll start off with the wrapper. The wrapper, the purpose of the wrapper is to provide some it condenses the content into the middle of the page a little bit and reduces the amount of space your eyes need to travel to the sides of the screen, and it just looks a lot more aesthetic than having elements just all over the place with big gaps between each other, etc. So for the approach I take on this is to set a wrapper on the entire document and then create a reset class, or in this case I actually added the styles on each element that needs to not be wrapped, but you could create a class called wrapper reset or unwrap or something like that, or just use Bootstrap's container classes, etc. to unwrap this, or just structure your HTML in a different way. But the way I do it is I create a wrapper that will condense everything, and if I need full width stuff, I will reset that thing based on either classes or just styles I add. And because this document isn't very big, I just decided to add the classes on each of the elements that need to be reset. So we want the wrapper to be 75 of the view width, and we want it to be in the middle. So I'm just going to do the margin 0 auto thing, which will create the wrapper and create the space on this side and on this side. Even though you can't see it, maybe this part, you can see on the right side there's space and on the left side. So I'm going to start off with the navbar as the first element that I target. And what we want to do with the navbar is kind of set the logo to the left side where it is and create a little bit more white space, because it doesn't look nice when the logo is right on top of the page. You really want to as he said, you want to create the consistency between the logo on top and bottom and the left and right side. So we want to set that logo a little bit down, and we want to move this list of links to the right side of the page. And like I said, I really like using display flex to do that. So let's just write the code. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a margin on the entire navbar, top and bottom of 20 pixels, and the right and left shouldn't be 20 pixels, so I'm just going to set that to 0. And then I'm going to add the display flex property, which will create the flex box. If you want to learn more about display flex, I would recommend checking out some of the links in the description. Maybe go to csstricks.com. They have a very good tutorial on display flex, and I believe I also have a video. If I do, I'll link it at the top of this video. But display flex, and what that will do is it will push everything into a flexbox container. So the natural state of display flex is to have everything aligned to the start of the flexbox. So this entire thing will be the flexbox, and these two elements are now at the start of the flexbox. So what we kind of want to do is split them up. And there's a cool property, a CSS property called justify content, and I'm just going to say space between, which will split up these two elements to their respective sides. And display flex also allows for a little bit of what do you call it, responsiveness. So this kind of looks responsive, but I'm not going to focus on responsive design. You could clone this repository and do the responsive design if you want to. So next up, we're going to get this the nav links to look a little bit better. First, I want to set a fixed height on the navbar, and the reason I want to do that is so that I can control the landing page size. And what I mean by that is that every device has a different view height, and I want to use view heights to control how that, to make sure that this entire landing page is 100% of the viewport, doesn't matter on what device you view it, so that it follows that design where the landing page has its full, it's above the fold. And to do that, I need to set a fixed height on the navbar. So to reset the nav links, I'm going to target them with the class I gave them, and I'll use the CSS property list style and just make that none. What this does, it takes the bullets away from the list, and it just makes them a list on top of each other. I think we're missing one link, home services about contact. If we look at the home services about, and then contact is just MIA. Okay, well, we'll find it soon. Let's just keep coding. The what we need to do is also list them next to each other instead of on top of each other. So the way we do that is actually just give this unordered list a display of flex as well, and that will automatically put them in a flex direction of row, and just remove the natural padding that is present on the unordered list. If we look at that now, we have all the items. So obviously this is not the correct, aesthetic, and we want to give them a little bit of space. So the way we do that is we're going to target the list items themselves. So we'll target the nav links and the li inside the nav links, and we'll say we want a margin top and bottom of 0, and on the sides 15 pixels. And I played with this a little bit, so if you prefer, if we'll have a look at this, and I'm just going to make the cursor pointer, but if you prefer less space in between or more space, that's up to you. But I feel like this is it accurately represents what the design Gary made showed. And just personal preference, I really like it when nav items indicate that we're hovering on them. So I'm just going to copy this selector and paste it here, and on hover I want it to indicate a little bit maybe a heavier font weight, so that we know that this is a link and it's gonna take us somewhere. If we hover now, you can see it it goes a little bit heavier, and that, to me, that feels a bit more intuitive for a nav bar. Okay, so next up, I want to target the landing section, and this is where we use the height thing that I spoke about. And what I want to do is I want to target the height of the landing section. So the landing section is everything from this image to this scroll thing. Obviously the sizing and scale and white space and everything is completely off right now, so we'll go through these elements one by one. But to start off, I really want to make sure that this is 100% of the view height. So let's get a calculation going. We know we want 100% of the view height, and the navbar is already taking 53 pixels, so we want to minus that from the 100% view height. And if we have a look at that, it does do it, but because this image is so large, it overflows. So what we have to do is reset the size of this image. So I'm just going to quickly target that and say hero image, and just make sure that the width is not too large. And I also played with this. I got it around 40 view width was the sweet spot for me. Let's just save that. Okay, something is up here. I'm gonna inspect this image. Oh, the problem is that I never gave the image the class that I'm selecting. So I'm just gonna go over to that image and give it the class of hero image. And then if we have a look at that now, okay, the image is a little bit smaller, and now our landing section fits onto our page. So obviously this isn't the correct order or scale, or all those fundamentals aren't correct yet. So let's just keep writing the CSS for these elements. So going back to the landing page, I also want to just use a simple fix for the alignment of everything, because the landing page, almost everything is centered. So I'm just going to use text align center, and if you do have elements that shouldn't be centered, there might be better approaches, but I noticed that if you use text align center for landing, it meets the criteria of this specific design. So that puts our little hero image in the center of the page, and the spacing on top and bottom kind of looks okay, but I think we could fix it a little bit. So I want to move it up a little bit actually, because it just doesn't it seems a bit pushed down. So I'm gonna say less 3 view widths, and the reason I use view widths for the margin top is actually for responsive for the responsiveness. It's not perfect, but a part of me couldn't just use pixels, because as the screen gets narrower, you don't want the margin to go up and down by the same pixels, because screens don't have the same aspect ratios, etc. So I just used 3 view widths for this one, and that makes it feel like the spacing is a little bit more accurate, and we can increase the spacing on these things, and use the visual hierarchy fundamental idea. So let's get into that. Next up, I want to target the hero title, and for the title I want to increase the font size a little bit, and I'm gonna use EMs here because I prefer using EMs for font size. And then margin top, I actually want to move it up a little bit as well. And if we look at the title now, it's going to be a little bit bigger. I moved it up a little bit because H items, heading HTML items have natural margins and paddings, and moving it up just sort of made it a little bit more accurate for the spacing between those. So the next item I want to target is the subtitle, and I think I called it just subtitle. So I'm gonna go landing and then subtitle, because in case we want to reuse the CSS class somewhere else, I just wanted to make sure it's specific. So let's use subtitle, and The subtitle I also want to move up a little bit to have it closer to the title, just to make sure that those elements seem like they belong together. And for the color, I'm gonna create that visual hierarchy by making it a dark gray instead of a black, and I'm gonna make the font weight a little bit thinner as well, so that we can really separate the importance of these two elements. Now you can see that this really takes your attention, where this is sort of just extra information. And obviously the next problem is that we need to move this scroll item. So let's tackle that. If we look at the scroller, it's always going to be in the same position at the bottom here. And one way I really like to position items like that is to just use absolute positioning, which could be a bit confusing when you start to get into like what needs to be relative, what needs to be absolute, etc. But for this item, I don't think we need to set any relative items, because it's going to use the first thing that it finds that's relative. So what I mean by that is it's going to keep looking at the parent element and until it reaches the end. So I'm just going to set a position absolute, and then make sure from the bottom it's 50 pixels. And then if we have a look at that, I probably forgot to add the class again. So if we look at this scroller, let's add the scroller class, save that, go back to and there we go. This looks pretty much like we want it to look. This needs to be at the bottom. So Gary mentioned that he would like to see this thing animated, and so I took the liberty of doing that. If we go back to the CSS, I just use basic CSS animation. There's more than one way you could do this, but I found that just a quick few keyframes was the way that I wanted to approach this. I just called it scroller, and at the 0% position I wanted it to be the bottom to be 53 pixels, and at the 100% of the animation I want it to be back to its normal position of 50 pixels. So to use this animation we need to add a few properties, and I'm going to think about browser usability and just use the WebKit animation as well. So I'm just going to actually copy these in and explain what they do and what they mean. So the animation name and WebKit animation name is what we named this keyframe over here. So the animation duration is how long we want this to happen, and I want it to happen over 500 milliseconds. And the way we get it to repeat itself is animation iteration count and setting that to infinite, and make sure it doesn't restart with every animation, so that it goes up and down, instead of up, down, stop, up, down, stop. And then just to ease it in and out to make it a little bit smoother, I use the timing function. There is a shortcut where you can add all these properties next to each other, but I kind of prefer having each one on its own line. So if we go have a look at that, you can see that the scroll button is now animating up and down. The next section that we're going to start with is the offerings with that blue with the blue SVG that we created with that specific design. I believe there is more than one way to do that. You could probably, instead of using an SVG, you could write the CSS from scratch to actually make those paint on the canvas, or I mean on the document. But I preferred using an SVG because SVGs do scale, and it's also not a very large file item, and it's much easier to position and control than having to write cropping the items or creating those curves, etc. So I just decided on going with exporting the SVGs. So the way I do that is that I named the section offerings, and the offerings section has 3 divs inside of them, which is the boxes. And again, this is where we'll use display flex. But let's first get started with the offerings section, and we'll talk about how it looks when you add this background. So I actually want to add a background image that will be the SVG in our assets, and we do that by adding a URL, and then I called it the second, so basically for second section. And if we go look at that now, it's gonna have this thing repeat itself, so we don't want that. We want to set the background repeat I could have just typed that, but whatever, no repeat, and that makes it so that it's 1. But now you'll see that this item is squeezed into that wrapper that we created, and it's also not the full width of the area that it's in. So to get it the full width, we want to set the background size. And I believe there's more than one way to do this, but this is the approach I took, is to make it a cover image, and to remove these side, the margin or the wrapper. I used a few reset CSS properties, and the way I did that is I made sure that the width goes to 99 view width, and the reason I don't use 100 is because it increases over the size of the document if you use 100. So 99 seems like the correct amount, but because we set it to 99% now, we still have that margin on or the wrapper pushing it in over there. So what I do to fix that is I push everything back by 12 view widths. I have to do negative view width so that it goes back into the document. And now you'll see the horizontal scroll is removed and the item fits exactly into the window. The next problem we have is that the SVG isn't big enough to fit all the content, and this is something I had to play with before finding the right amount, but I found that setting a height of 600 pixels is enough to sort of contain all 3 of those sections. So that's what we'll tackle next, because we want these to be displayed next to each other. So again, we'll use flex and sort of fix the line height and make sure there's enough padding and the colors and the visual hierarchy. So let's get to that. Inside the offerings, we have our offer boxes. Could have probably named this a little bit better, but it's fine. So offer boxes is, if we go look at the HTML, the divs are contained, the images and information is contained in the offer boxes. But before we can actually target or do anything with offer boxes, we really want them to be displayed next to each other. So the way I do that is just by simply adding, again, the display flex property. And that makes them position next to each other. And obviously they aren't in the correct position because they are at the top of the section. So we really want to move them down a little bit. I'm not going to move them inside the offering section because that's where the background is, and if we add margins and stuff like that, the background image will move around. So that's why I use the offer boxes to position these items. And the way I do that is just adding display flex again, and then using align items to center, and also using justify content to center so that everything gets positioned in a more accurate way. Now we also kind of want these items to be stacked on top of each other instead of next to each other. So the way I approach that is just by changing the flex direction to column. and that will create a stacked look. So the next problem we have is that the padding of these blocks aren't correct. You can see that there's inconsistency. Um, it's way too close to the edge of the screen, and the line height isn't correct, and the spacing between the elements aren't correct. So we can approach that. We can take the approach of just targeting these items and just making sure that they're positioned in the correct order. So first off, I'm going to start with the line height of the text, because that's also a big visual thing. It's visually disturbing when the lines are so close to each other, and also the black on the blue doesn't work. So I'm going to set the color to white, and some of the other things. Also, what I want to do is just sort of contain these a little bit more, create padding, and make sure that it doesn't look as spread out as it does right now. So we'll just add padding inside of this offer box. Zero padding on the top and bottom, and I found 100 pixels left and right to be the closest to the original design. And then we kind of want these the items inside of the offer boxes to move down. So I don't want to move the entire box down, but just the content. And the way I approach that is just by targeting the images inside the offer box, because when the images get pushed down, the content below it will also get pushed down. So I just created a margin on top of 100 pixel. And I guess you could use 100 pixel padding inside the offer boxes, but I prefer using the margin on this one. So now the items look like they're spaced out a little bit better and more accurate towards the actual design. So next up, we're going to address the problem of these giant images of this lady and create or make them look like actual testimonials instead of just splash images of a lady. So I called the section and I gave it the class of testimonials. And again, I know I probably use this way too much, but it just always works for me. Display flex. The background was a little bit more gray than the document, and I like using this off-white grayish color for that. And then again, using that reset of the wrapper. And like I said, you could create a class that has these properties set on them and just put them on all the elements you want out, or move your wrapper to not contain these items, or put a wrapper on each of those that actually just need it. But this is the approach I took on this one, and there could be a few flaws to that, but for now, just because I want to get the example through, I don't think it's that big of an issue, because it works. And then just move it again, and what I want to do is justify the content with space between, so that the items are evenly spaced and the testimonials will be pushed next to each other. So that looks still a little bit horrid. Let's fix the images of the testimonials so that we can actually see what's going on there. So first of all, I'm going to target the testimonials and then the images in there. And what I want to do is just give them a another width. I don't like the width, and I might actually just do that on the actual HTML instead of the CSS. But you could approach it anyway. Let's just do it here. Let's add width of 100 pixels, and then border radius of 50%, and this will create that round. If your image is a perfect square, it'll create a perfect circle, but mine's a little bit more rectangular, so the images are a little bit more upright, but that's fine in this case. And then next up, what we want to do is we want to position the quotes next to the image and sort of create the spacing. So the way I approached moving the quotes next to the image is with the older way of sort of getting the image or getting stuff to move to the left or right of something. Before we had display flex and grid, etc. And I just simply added a float on the images. So I'm just gonna float the image to the left so that the text is on the right and the image is to the left, and give it a bit of space. So I'm just gonna add a margin on the right of I think I used I just used pixels in this one. So that will sort of create a little bit of space between the image and the text on the right of the image. So next up, we obviously need to look at the scale and white space of this section, because it's horrible. It's just basically exactly the size of the image. So we kind of want to create even spacing around these and also push them in a little bit. So let's do that by, I'm going to add these selectors on top of the image because I feel they should be in the same hierarchy as the HTML. So I'll target the container that I created inside the testimonials. So that's the reason I created it, is so I can have another element inside of the testimonials that I can work with when it's display flexed. So I'm going to target that, and I'm going to give it some padding, top and bottom of 50 pixels, and then on left and right I used EMs instead of pixels, so that it's just a little bit more responsive, and that kind of already looks perfect. It might be a little bit off in that these items are closer to the edge than this, so you could play with that. So for the testimonials, the text that we have there, I just want to adjust the font style to have it be italic, so that it matches the design. If we look at that, everything is now italic, and the name of the person I want to also adjust to match the design, which was, I believe it was the same blue color as we used for the second section. So I'm just going to adjust the color to, I have the hex value for that, it's 00B1FF, and also I want to increase the font weight to give it a bit of a different feel. I'm going to make that 600. Save that, and if we look at it now, this tag is a little bit different to what they were saying. So we're at our second last section now, the start, the free trial, and the button, which in the original design, these are positioned next to each other. This is a bit larger, lighter font weight, and the button has a specific design. So let's get into those CSS properties. The section was the call to action section, so let's just start off by using our good old trusty display flex. The reset, because we want it to be reset as well, compared to, because we have that wrapper on. And then I want to add a margin at the top of the section, and I had to play with this a bit to make sure that when that automatic scroll, which we'll do in JavaScript in a second, lands, and it looks pretty, it looks accurate. So I can just do, I want to do these separately, margin top, margin bottom of 80 pixels, and then the reason I'm doing them separate is because I want to target margin left separately as well. You could do the shorthand where it's top, right, bottom, left, but I just I'm going to use this, and I'm going to -12 view width, that those reset properties that we set, and then justify the content in the center, because that's where the call to action was. And now we have it looking like this. Obviously this button is horrendous and nothing aligns, nothing looks good. So let's fix that. We'll start off by targeting the text. It has to be larger and it has to have a lower font weight. Let's give it a margin of 0 and 25 pixels on the left and right, so that there's a bit of space created between the button and the text. And then I want to decrease the font weight a little bit because the H items do look a little bit bolder. So I'm going to use 400, and I want to increase the font size as well to 2.5 EMs. And if we look at that, you'll see that is a little bit closer to the actual design. And now let's target the button and fix the horrendousness of it. So let's target the button. I didn't give it a class, I'm just going to target the element itself. And then the background of the button, the background color was the same green we used in the logo. I think it's 00CC80. And then I'm going to remove the natural border, but I'm going to add a border radius on the button so that it has the rounder effect, because we want to keep consistent with all the other round things on the page, and it's a more fluid design. And if there were more square elements, we might think of making it square. So let's just give it a border radius of 15 pixels. Increase the font size just a little bit, and then I want to add some padding on the button as well. The top and bottom a little bit less. I'm gonna give it like a ratio of 1 to 2, so the left and right will be 2 times more padded than the top and bottom, so it's a little bit elongated. And the text color I want to be white, and the cursor I want to make a pointer just to give it the illusion that this is a clickable button. And we're gonna, wow, that's really tiny. I think I might have messed up something. Oh, EM instead of pixels. Yeah, so this gives it the effect that it's a little bit longer, and if you hover it, it looks like it's clickable. We could actually remove the active class once we click on it to get rid of that blue. Actually, let's do that. Let's do that, and I think it's active pseudo selector. Not sure. I think it might be the outline, but just to be sure, I'm gonna just do the border as well. So let's have a look at that. It might also be the what is it called? It's focus. Let's look at that. Okay, so that's a little bit better. I guess we could adjust it so that it depresses or comes out a little bit, but that's not the point of the video for now. You could add that. You could clone the repository and maybe do a bit of a clicking effect on the button. But as for the last section, let's get into the footer. So the footer will be a lot like the second section, where we have to set a background, make it full screen, reset the size of the wrapper, etc. So I'm just going to copy those in, and because they're pretty much going to be the same. So we set the background image to that SVG that I created. We remove the repeat, we make it a cover size, we we reset the width to 99%. So the only difference is I made it a little bit smaller because there isn't as much content in the footer, and there was way too much white space when you look at the text and links. So I gave it a display flex so that we could move those two elements. We can actually remove this one because there's already one here, and then space between to separate the if we look at the footer, there's this left footer and there's the right footer. So to separate those two with the even space between each other, I use the justify content. And something is up. Let's just have a look at the justify content, display flex. So these in fact should be on the right side, because that's what we have in the HTML. Let's have a look. Hmm. Oh, yeah, obviously because it's not a class, it's an actual HTML element. Rookie error. Yeah, that looks much better. So now we have that the inverted design of the footer compared to this section, and it just creates that consistency, but also a little bit of a different feel. So obviously we need to adjust some of these things. Let's just get into that quite quick. I mean, it also needs to be padded. You need to have the scale correct, and the white space is obviously off, and we're losing consistency if we do this. So let's just get those fixed. The first thing I want to do is target. I gave the classes to the items in the left footer and also the right footer. And the reason I gave them separate classes is so I could do their padding separately and give them a margin. So the padding, uh, this one needs padding left because it's on the left side. I want it to be 12%, and the margin on the top of it should be 81 pixels is what I found. It's a very odd number, but that's what I found. I'm going to actually copy these, paste that in there. Instead of left, I'm going to do right here. Save that, and if we have a look, it's a bit more pushed in now. And now we start getting into is this too much padding? And this really bothers my eyes. I don't know if you guys could see it or picked up on it, but the most of the items, if you look at this logo, its spacing compared to this spacing is it's not the same. This spacing compared to this spacing, so actually nothing is really consistent with these spacings. So what we might want to do is just create a bit more consistency by either moving this out or bringing this in a little bit more from the sides and creating more padding, and bringing this out a little bit. So let's actually fix that spacing because it's quite important fundamental thing that I've actually just noticed now, that I think if we look at those steps that Gary gave us to think about, and this is probably where you could see that why he has so much experience, and he's done this so much more that I didn't even notice this creating this, but now that I look at it from that perspective, I can see that there's almost no consistency with the padding and stuff. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to push in these a little bit more to be closer to this item, but I don't think I want to have them that close because then the items might become too small with all the padding. And then I think what I'll do is I'll line them up to this image because you rarely will see this logo and these items at the same time on the page. So I think the important thing is to have this, and this closer to each other. So let's play with the padding on those. For the testimonial section, let's look at the container and padding top bottom. I think this should be, let's see, it should be smaller, or should it be bigger? Yeah, it needs to be smaller. So the container, I want to have padding top and bottom of 50 pixels and left and right. Let's play with this. Actually, let's use the dev tools so that we don't have to keep coming back. So, oh, I was working on the wrong element. What we could do here is we could look at this padding. It's 100 pixels, and for the testimonials, we have different padding of 12 EM, and for the offer boxes we have, so let's try adding a 12 EM here. Actually, let's do 10 because I like the 10. Save that. Okay, so now we have the consistency, but the text in the offer boxes aren't, it doesn't look right to me anymore. I think we need to widen them out a little bit and center the text as well. So let's just do text align, center. That looks a little bit better already. And I think we could widen them just a little bit because it looks like there's too much space in between them. So the best way I could figure out how to space these offer boxes to have them on the left and right side be the same consistency as these, but also have them wide enough is to use a few CSS pseudo selectors. So I'm going to start off by just adding the padding I want in general, which is 5 EMs, but that creates inconsistency on the left and right side. So I need to target these separately and make sure that the padding is consistent with the others. So the way I'm going to do that is just use offer boxes and pseudo selector first child and say I mean first of type, I think, and then just add padding left because it's the first one of 10 EMs, which is consistent with the testimonials, and that fixes that that side. And so for the other side we'll use dot offer boxes, but the last of type, and use padding right on this one, and we'll add 10 EM to be consistent as well. So that looks a little bit better. The spacing is consistent on the left and right with these items, and you don't really notice that this spacing and this spacing is not the same padding, because we sort of have 10 on this side, 10 on this side, but this one has 5 on this side and 5 on this side. So that's 10 in between them, 10 in between 10. So that's why we had to play with the CSS a little bit. So yeah, next up we have the problem that these are also now way too pushed in. The padding is too much. So let's go back to the footer. We can look at which item has the padding. So we have 12% on the left footer and 12. So let's just stay consistent with our EMs. Save that. Have a look, and that actually seems to be a little bit off still. So let's make it a little bit less because it was too far in. Let's make 9. Save that. Eight. Closer. I think 7 will do the trick. And that looks pretty accurate to me and consistent. So to finish this off, let's make these links display next to each other instead of on top of each other. And the way I'm going to do that is just, as always, the right footer, we can just add our trusted display flex to have them in a row. And if you think about responsive design, display flex might not always be the best option, but for this example, because I'm only doing it on the screen, on this screen size, I believe display flex is okay. So I also want to fix the margin in between these items. So let's target the P tags specifically, which are also supposed to mock links. So we can add a cursor pointer to them, and we could add that margin in between them just to have it a bit more consistent. I think 8 pixels should be good. Let's have a look. And yeah, that looks fine to me. The one thing is that I already spoke about this asset wasn't exported with white text, so yeah, you could clone this repository and do that yourself. The other thing that you might notice on this section is the space at the bottom and the space at the top here. The reason I do that is let's get into the JavaScript first, and then I can show you by example. So for the JavaScript, I want that scroll animation or that scroll effect when we when we load the page the first time. So the way I control that is by just loading a variable into memory that just says no, we haven't scrolled yet, and then I'll add an event listener to the document. The event is the scroll event, and for the callback function, what we want to do is trigger this logic that if the page is starting to scroll, just snap it to a certain point. So let's just use this dot page y offset. I think should be a capital O as well. And this is just this item in this function is the window object. The global window object is this. So if the global window is offset on the y by more than or equal to 100 pixels, and we haven't scrolled yet, so this is the first time we start scrolling, then let's create a separate function. Let's just call it smooth scroll, and give it the window object. I guess we don't need to give it the window object, but I'm just going to do it for this example. And then let's create that function. That smooth scroll equals a function that takes actually no, I'm not gonna give it anything. I'm just gonna make it a function that doesn't take anything, and just call the window object in here, because we don't need to give it the window, we already have access. So there's a function called window.scroll2, and I also only found out recently that you can actually give it options. I found out that I wanted to scroll to exactly I think this point, where if we look at it, the spacing looks a bit better now, but after the scroll, now the spacing looks a bit off, and I just decided that it's more important to have the scroll at the exact position when landing, instead of having the space look weird when we land on this section of scroll. So the exact point that I determined that is, just by inspecting the window, is at 1064 pixels, and you actually have an option called behavior, so that we don't have to write weird timing functions. We can just use smooth, so that it will smooth scroll by itself. And then right after that happened, we want to set scrolled to true, so that this function doesn't get called anymore after the first scroll. Otherwise we'll have like an infinite, because it will keep listening to the scroll event. So let's save that and go look at it. Let's go to the top and reset, and there, now it just snapped to it. I found that this does happen like for the first few times, but on the, let's have a look at it. Okay, I'm not sure why it's snapping. The smooth timing function seems to be not working. Let's restart this live server quickly. Okay, well, instead of debugging this right now, I'm just gonna leave it like this. If you maybe find the error in the code, or notice some error, maybe typo or something, you could just submit a pull request on my GitHub. But this should be actually just on the first load. Once you start scrolling, it should not snap like that. It should actually go a little bit smoother. But yeah, that's fine for now, I guess. let it just snap. We'll have a snappy page. But what I was trying to say about the spacing on the Start Your Free Trial Now is I like having it centered after that scroll effect instead of having it centered when it's here, and then when that scroll effect happens, it's going to be lower. And I guess we could move around more elements, but then we might create way too much white space in general. And I think that this position might be a bit better because now this is like a second page and everything on this page is where it should be. And when you start scrolling, only now your eye sort of catches this space. And what we could do is add maybe more JavaScript that says when we scroll from this position, sort of animate this down slowly, or make sure that this is in the correct position, because I don't want to move this up either, because then this area, this gap on this side is a little bit too much. So I guess that also comes down to this SVG and how it's slanted. It might have been, there might have been better design options, but yeah, you could look at this code and maybe you could fix it. But yeah, I guess that's all of the code that's necessary for this project. I don't know why the scroll thing is being a little bitchy, but I probably will figure it out a little bit later and change the code on GitHub. But anyway, thanks guys for watching this video. I hope it was helpful. I hope somebody learned something from it, or just, you know, you could catch one or two gold nuggets from it. All these assets will be available on the GitHub repository. If you like this video and you maybe want to see more, leave a comment below, or just like the video, or subscribe and contact me. Let me know if you want to see specific things. Yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.